Hi, shalom everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of Crossing Borders, Global Connections and Conversations. I'm Kim Pastor-Yosef, the Director of Operations at MEJDI Tours. Joining me today, co-hosting with me is our wonderful co-founder, Aziz Abusera. And we want to say thanks to the team that made this happen.
Thank you, Kim. We are at MEJDI Tours are also staying in our home and keeping our physical distance like everybody else. But we are also hoping to remain in contact with our community, the community of travelers who have made friends all over. My friend Jean Newman Glock, who's one of the top travel planners in the world, just wrote that she doesn't usually count the countries she visits, but instead she actually counts the people she made as friends in those places. And I believe that many of our travelers are exactly the same. We count the people we become friends with.
And one of the reasons we were founded is to actually create opportunities to connect, to find more friends. And Yuval was talking about this on our last episode about him being a guide and missing meetings with new people, getting to know new people. And that's what we're trying to do with our podcast, with our live stream, to bring these interesting people to you twice a week.
Yes, but before we start, we thought let's have a little bit of fun. And so starting next week, we want to start a competition. You'll be able to submit a photo that focuses on the subject that we will announce, which usually will be the subject of the show of the week. And the winner will get a copy of my next book, Crossing Boundaries, A Traveler's Guide to World Peace.
Yes, and our next episode will be hosting Steve Rubin, a tour guide that he usually takes his travelers off the beaten path. So that's what we're looking for, photos of you traveling not only with MEJDI, but around the world on your own, with us, without us. A nice photo that you think is very remote, somewhere no one else knows. And please send it to info@mejditours.com. By 5 p.m. on Saturday.
But now, let us start with introducing our special guests, two of my dear friends. I want to start with Reverend Dr. May Cannon. May is one of the hardest working people I probably have ever met. She has multiple master's degrees and multiple doctorates. She's accumulating so much knowledge and education, but she's also one of the most devoted people I know to the Middle East, not only to the Christian community there through her work with CMIP, Churches for Middle East, but truly to everybody that she meets there. And joining us also from Jerusalem, Rabbi Dr. Daniel Roth, who I've known for over 10 years right now, and a very, very dear and close friend. Daniel is the director of Mosaica, the Religious Peacemaking Initiative. He is a professor at Bar Ilan, and he works with religious leaders on every side to build peace movement that is not only focusing on seculars, but rather bringing also religious leaders of every kind, radical, less radical, to make peace really sustainable.
So both of our guests are leading very interesting organizations. I think we should start with having them give some background about their organizations. May, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm grateful to be with each of you. Aziz and Daniel and I have had the privilege of traveling together and speaking at synagogues and churches all over the United States. And I just have to say, the only thing I'm grieving in this moment is that Aziz is not cooking Middle Eastern food for us before we chat. So thank you. It's a gift to be together virtually. I have the privilege of being the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace, which is an organization that's a Christian coalition of almost 30 denominations and member communions. It's been around 36 years, and for decades we've been traveling to the Holy Land with MEJDI. So we're grateful for our partnership in that regard, and our work is about educating American Christians and anyone who wants to be with us, of course, certainly in the multi-faith context, but educating American Christians about realities in the Middle East, realities in Israel, Palestine, the broader Arab world. And so what does it mean for us to be faithful followers of Jesus in that context, who don't just travel to the Holy Land to see the sights, but actually to meet the people as well?
Thanks, May. We'll definitely follow up with a few questions later. Daniel?
So first, I'll say it's an honor to be here with everyone, and I think this is the first time that May, Aziz, and I are traveling where you mentioned Middle East food, where I'm not driving everyone crazy trying to find me kosher food. So I have it right here at home. So I'll say a little bit about Mosaica. Mosaica is a center that promotes third-party peacemakers. That we do everything from community mediation, family mediation. We have about 60 centers throughout Israel in all the different sectors. And also we have what's called the Religious Peace Initiative, that we work with the most influential, often extreme, religious leaders in the Islamic world and in the Jewish world in Israel, and bringing them together in deep conversations around what would a religious peace look like that would support a political agreement as well. That's been around for about 20 years, and founded by some of the great leaders that are wonderful visionaries for how to get out of the stuck situation in the Middle East conflict.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, the three of us have, for the last 3 years, have traveled every year for about 2 weeks, 3 weeks together, going across the United States, talking about interfaith, talking about religion and peace. And there's a lot of cool, fun things that happen through our travels together. Maybe we can share a couple of fun stories. Who would like to start? May, Daniel?
Well, maybe I'll start. I mean, I think one of the funny things is that we've each heard each other's stories in so many various shapes and forms that we could tell each other's stories. And so I think that's a privilege to know each other in that context. We've traveled in Michigan, we've traveled in DC. We got invited by the State Department to attend a celebration of the Tibetan New Year with the US Department of State, who, by the way, doesn't even recognize Tibet as being independent. So that was probably one of my favorite memories as well.
Thank you. Daniel, what's one of your favorites?
So first I will say that I have the distinct honor of having been on the first ever MEJDI trip, as far as I know, with you, Aziz.
Yes.
That goes back a good few years. But specifically, when I think about some funny moments of the three of us, I think about our conversation that we had in the middle of the night traveling from one city to another about the afterlife. And it was a combination of deep theological discussions and a lot of hard laughs. I don't know if either of you remember that. We're on the way to the airport, we're rushing, and all we're talking about is, what does a Jewish afterlife look like? What's a Christian afterlife? Are we all going to be able to be roommates upstairs one day? Like, how is that all going to work? And it was something about the hour that made that conversation honestly incredibly funny for me.
All right, I'll add one since I was with you, and sorry, I'll have to do this, Daniel. But I think you and I are trying to do ghost hunting or meeting one night. We stayed in Salem, I think, in this old hotel that we were told is there are some ghosts there, and Daniel and I, after a long day and night,
where they had ghost tourism.
Yes, they said people would come specifically for a specific room there where a girl named Sally was, and Daniel and I decided to explore that room and asked if we can do that, and we were told yes. And so we went up, got terrified together, laughed like we've never probably laughed before, and we thought we met the ghost, but I think we were wrong. So that's one of my best memories of fun. Obviously, we've had so many fun memories together.
That was Salem, North Carolina, not Salem, Massachusetts, for those who might be interested.
Right.
Yeah, we were saying on our last episode that everyone should go on Google Maps and try to travel from your computer. So thanks, May. And if we're talking about travels, then May, you were talking about educating Christians. I know that you prepare a lot of groups to come to the Holy Land. How would you say, or what is the most important thing that you prepare them for?
Yeah. I mean, I think for most of us, either if we grew up in the church or if we consider ourselves members or active in the church today, the dream of traveling to the Holy Land, of going to Israel, the place of the Hebrew scriptures, the place, you know, for us where Jesus lived and breathed and did ministry, this is a lifetime aspiration. And so many, many millions of Christians dream of going to the Holy Land. But most of the time, the picture, I mean, and this was the case for myself as well, the picture that we have in our minds of what that means is really like, in Christian Sunday schools for children back in the day, we used to use felt, where you would tell these Bible stories with like felt camels and felt, right? So we have this idea of the Holy Land today being like these felt pictures, you know, of camels and things like that, you know. And I think what people most need to know is, and we talk about this all the time, is that we don't travel to the region to see the dead stones of the land, but the living stones of the land, the living people, you know, the people there who call the place holy because it's sacred to them, but Christians and Jews and Muslims. And so one of the things that grieves us is the millions and millions of tourists who go there every year and don't meet a person. I mean, other than the tour guide or the people at the hotel or the people in the industry. And so we love, love, love MEJDI tours that are, you know, multi-narrative and expose people to these ancient historical sites, the sacredness of the place, but the incredible and profound hope and hospitality of the people who live there now. So preparing them for that. Yeah.
Can you walk me maybe through, I mean, it's not only Israel and Palestine, I've worked with Christian groups all over, and what is it, it's not also only Christian groups, but in this case relating to Christians, what is it that makes people kind of not realize that, you know, I meet Christians who've been to Jerusalem who don't know there are Christian Palestinians. I meet Christians who've been to Bethlehem and don't realize that the Christians, they're Christian Americans or Christian Europeans, that there are people there who are locals. When they plan their trips, what is it that makes them sometimes not realize the importance of meeting people? What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what's happened is 2,000 years of history that many of us are ignorant of, right? So I'll use myself as an example because I was a classic case of someone who dreamt of going to a place that I only knew as Israel. I traveled there, you know, well over a decade ago, and I was very well educated. I had 3 master's degrees. I was getting my first doctorate. It wasn't that I was ignorant of the world, if you will. And as I traveled there, I started to see things about the modern contemporary geopolitics, about the conflict. And I saw signs, for example, that said, "Free Palestine." And honestly, Aziz, I mean, you've probably heard me tell this story. I thought Palestine was a map in the back of my Bible from 2,000 years ago. I was like, what are they talking about? Free Palestine. I didn't even know what the story of the Palestinian people were. And I was very well educated, right? And so, I mean, I think so much of it is we don't know the history. And it's not just the Palestinian history, it's the history of the Jewish people. I mean, the vast majority of Americans I know are well familiar with the history of the Shoah or the Holocaust, but we don't know the history of the Jewish people as it relates specifically to the land of Israel, right? So the history we think of the Jewish people is 2,000 years old from the Hebrew scriptures, not from, you know, this much broader. I mean, Daniel, I'll remember the very first conversation you and I ever had about the differences in Christian thought and Jewish thought. You know, for Christians think there's a very definitive answer to everything. And, you know, Daniel has taught me that the Jewish perspective is very different, 49 times 49. And so in that regard, we just have a lot to learn and a lot we miss when we anticipating traveling to places where we don't know the history.
Right.
Daniel, is it similar for Jewish groups traveling around the world, do you feel?
I'll share that, you know, for Jewish Orthodox groups traveling, as I already alluded to earlier, the number one question is, where are we going to find kosher food? Okay, that's the first question. The second question is, can we find a Jewish tour so that we're, you know, whether we're in Venice or we're in, you know, in Paris, and I've traveled with my family, I'm always asking, you know, what's the Jewish stories? Who were the Jewish leaders? And I think that's a lot of the way Jews travel to Israel, and they're looking for that Jewish narrative, and they'll be blinded to seeing that there are other narratives out there. They just literally will not meet anybody that is not part of that narrative. They won't see it. I think even many years ago as a kid, we would travel to Israel and we would go to the Arab market. I don't think tourists do that anymore. So they really just don't see Palestinians. And I think that I personally have had a lot of transformative moments traveling. When I think about the fact that my first time ever going to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and going close to the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa was because of a MEJDI tour that I went with Aziz. And there's something about seeing things. You had Hussam on your last Zoom call. I had Hussam take 15 families from my very traditional congregation, very Zionist Jewish congregation, and say, just take them to see Bethlehem, just see the wall, just see what's happening. How could we not visit and not just know intellectually, but until you travel, you don't know it. And I think that's why it's important for me to also speak to many of the MEJDI trips, because I think that's part of my own theology of understanding perspectives in contradictory ways, as May alluded to, which I think MEJDI really does its best to try to do.
Well, Daniel, you talked about how Jews travel and coming to Israel and Palestine, but you're a very busy person. You're teaching, you're doing all these peace negotiations, you're in touch with Muslims and Christians and Jews and all over. And yet you give a lot of time to meet with groups coming and talk to them about religious peacemaking. You talk to them about what their perspective should be from your view on what's happening. Why do you do that?
You know the answer, Aziz. The answer is always because I love Aziz and I believe in doing what he asks me to do. No, I'll be honest. It's because I really, really believe in that mission, as I was saying beforehand. Like, I think it's so incredibly important for people to go on a trip and come back what I see as being narrative translators. We're in narrative conflict. We have at least two radically different ways of seeing the exact same experiences, exact same land, exact same mountain, calling it different things. And the world is facing more and more narrative conflicts, even in the coronavirus, where we think we're all in the same story, and I realize everybody's seeing it in such totally different ways. And I think what MEJDI has done uniquely, which is the same way I see the way we study Talmud, which is understanding disagreement and perspectives, I see that MEJDI is doing their best by having the two different tour guides and try to see all the different interpretations of those narratives. And for me, the more you have people that travel that way and then come back and can help others that have not yet traveled understand the contradictory narratives and help translate them one to the other, I think we get closer to peace.
I have so many follow-up questions to both of you with so little time. I did want to talk a little bit about what we're dealing with right now, the coronavirus outbreak, and ask you if you feel that religious leaders have a role in this, in coping with this situation.
May, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I think the short answer is yes. Religious leaders have a significant role. I hope not the least of which is to help people feel peace and calm and comfort in the midst of being isolated. But I think one of the points I heard Daniel talk about in light of COVID-19 and the way it's affecting communities is that it doesn't really affect us all equally if we all have different levels of need before the virus spread. And so in that regard, the disproportionate effect of the virus on those in our communities who are under-resourced or who have limited access to healthcare, I mean, we're seeing this all over the Middle East. And so our largest concerns are where there's already places where there's a humanitarian crisis. So let's talk about Yemen, the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time before COVID. What's it look like when you have a pandemic virus come through a community that doesn't have access to basic water water, let alone, the ability to be able to wash your hands, let alone the ability to be able to isolate and stand 6 feet away from other people in your community. We're desperately concerned about Gaza and what this is going to look like in Gaza, where you have 2 million people in a very small geographic radius, and where there's a blockade that is limiting the ability for people to be able to travel in and out, which I know we don't want to be traveling right now, but those realities of the virus, I think religious leaders have a spiritual role to play. I mean, we were talking earlier, Daniel and Aziz and I, about the theological questions that are being raised as a result of the virus. The big question in the Christian communities is Easter is just on the horizon. It's Holy Week. I mean, this is for Jerusalem the most sacred of times for people who follow Jesus. And so how do we celebrate? How do we worship? I was thinking about Palm Sunday coming. Are we all going to get on video and have our palm branches? And the theological question of, can we share communion when communion in many of our traditions needs to be ordained by a priest or by a pastor? And so those are challenges for religious leaders. I think my last comment in that regard, I literally just saw in the news this morning, Florida in the United States has allowed a dispensation for Christian churches to continue to worship in person because they said that it's an essential need. And I fundamentally believe that our faith and our community is an essential need, but not when it's at the cost of our neighbors, even to the point of death. And so it's deeply disconcerting to me that some of our religious communities are not practicing social distancing, not because I don't think our physical presence with one another is critical, I believe it is, but because we need to be concerned, about the safety of our elderly and those who are vulnerable in our communities.
Right. Daniel?
So I'll share that first of all, I mean, so much of religion is about being in community, like what May was saying. And for Jews, that's affecting us on so many different levels that we pray 3 times a day with 10 men. That's what makes up a congregation in order to be able to pray as a community, which is a very important aspect of Judaism. And, the whole dilemma of closing down the synagogues and that people praying alone is really, really challenging. We have Passover coming up in just a few days, and there it's the most family-oriented holiday, and you have all these elderly people who are alone, not being with their children and grandchildren. And as a result, certain rabbis have made certain new rulings that are saying that you can use a Zoom call on some level because they're afraid that people are going to sneak out on the holiday and try to be with loved ones. Or can we even congregate as a minyan, as a group of 10 over Zoom? So these are all sorts of questions, but I want to add that the role of narrative here is critical, because from a deeply religious narrative, which secular people might not understand because we worship and understand science. But for deeply religious people, the world is controlled by God, and this is some kind of sign by God. And the way Judaism and Islam, as I'm familiar with it, responds is that you're supposed to gather together and pray together when you have a terrible plague like this, and come to the mosque, come to the synagogue, come to the church, fast, or do other prayers, and then to say no one come together, everyone be alone, science is kind of ruling the final word, is really hard. And I'll just share that one of the senior Islamic leaders, senior authorities that I work with, Sheikh Raed Badir, he was the first already 4 weeks ago, to write a fatwa, an Islamic ruling, saying all the mosques around the Middle East have to be shut down. And he said it's because we have to listen to the doctors. And he made a ruling that since the first time since Muhammad the Prophet, the muazzin is going to call people not to come to the mosque, stay at home and protect yourself. And he wrote a radical, ruling at the time. And he went from one Islamic leader to the other in Iraq, in Kuwait, in Qatar, convincing them to shut down all their mosques. And what's amazing is that in many of these areas, every single mosque is shut down again for the first time in history. And it comes from the same theology of peace, that it's about saving lives, and the same thing that we have to listen to how to save lives in this terrible, tragic moment today as well.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, this is time to have some questions from the audience with us, and we already got our first one. And it says, basically, not everybody is going to be able to go and visit Israel and Palestine, but true everywhere as well. So how do we get people to know that there is more than one narrative about Israel without being able to travel there, considering that, you know, if you listen to the media, often, like in many other issues, it's a black and white, and it's not the case. When people come, they realize that. So what would you tell people to do to get that story to those who don't travel?
I'll jump in.
Go
ahead, Daniel. I'll defer.
No, I like to say that you mentioned the media, and we all know that the more media there is, the more in a bubble we find ourselves. And I think that one of the tools, so this is important for understanding different narratives around Israel and Palestine, but also true about the multiple narratives happening in the US or in Europe, is for people to push themselves to read contradictory news. I work very hard to listen to Fox and CNN, to read, you know, what we call Haaretz in Israel and Makor Rishon, which is the right-wing, left-wing papers. And it takes discipline. It's not easy, but I think there's no other way to understand the different narratives other than reading contradictory news. And at the same time, trying to have friends in relationship over social media or in person that disagree with us and that understand different perspectives. And I think that that's critical. It's not the same as experiencing it over a MEJDI tour, but it's the best you can do without going on one.
I have two resources I would add to that. And actually, Aziz has been involved in both, and I'm grateful. So one of them is a book that we compiled that is just what you described, Daniel, The Contradictory Truths. It's called A Land Full of God. It's written from Christian perspectives. So the subtitle is A Land Full of God, Christian Perspectives on the Holy Land, but it has 30 chapters of 30 different types of perspectives. So historians, there's politicians, there's theologians, and Aziz and Daniel graciously wrote the introduction for the book, for which I'm grateful. And that book includes Christian Zionist perspectives, and then Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote a chapter, you know, that he talks about apartheid. So it's completely contradictory in terms of what you're describing, Daniel, but I think it helps us to understand multiple perspectives and to expand our horizons in that regard. The other resource I would offer, which there's some great videos of Aziz in this resource, is the curriculum that Churches for Middle East Peace put together for church groups. Because our audience is primarily Christians, it's a 5-part curriculum that does a bit of theology, a bit of history of Christians in the land, a bit of the geopolitics of the region. So it's really a broad introduction, but from a multi-narrative perspective. So those are two resources I would offer that are available on our website at www.cmep.org.
If you're mentioning that I will say we also put out a 5-part series of how to understand contradictory narratives around Israel called Machloket Matters, which means in Hebrew, disagreement matters. You can type in M-A-H-L-O-K-E-T matters.
Yeah, and Melissa here just mentioned The Lemon Tree, another great book that we would recommend. We do at MEJDI recommend that people do read it. So reading is definitely a great part. And I think try to not read also only from American writers. Try to read from people who live there, locals, Palestinians, Israelis who also live there.
Do you want to continue with the questions, Aziz?
Yeah, go ahead. Pick one.
So we have another question asking if you can envision a radically different style of politics in Israel-Palestine coming out of this pandemic, with mutual independence extending from the public health arena to governance and human rights. Sorry.
What was the first word? If you can what?
Envision a radically different style of politics in Israel-Palestine coming out of the pandemic.
Those of you who are not following, the Israeli political scene is in a little bit of a mess right now. So envisioning any kind of political difference in Israel is hard. I do hope that there is a deep sense of responsibility and connection between political leaders, including the leaders in Gaza, and Hamas that Israel should be in touch with and continue to be in touch with over the humanitarian crisis that's awaiting us. But I don't necessarily see a tremendous shift in that regard, other than to say that I think that it's possible that coronavirus is going to change a lot of the way things are functioning. So it's hard to say, but yeah.
The organization I lead is based in Washington, D.C., and we see it as our role not to influence Palestinian political engagement or even Israeli political engagement, but to influence U.S. actors in our own political environment. And one of our deep concerns of this current administration in Washington, D.C. is that the politics and the proposed peace to prosperity plan coming out of the White House, it's very unilaterally supportive of one people group over another. And we see that any political solution would really need to be one that addresses the needs of all people in the land, Israelis, the vast majority of whom are Jewish Israelis, but the 20% of Palestinian citizens of Israel, certainly Palestinians living in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. And so we have significant concerns about US engagement in that regard. And so a lot of our work is really in Washington, D.C. to try to encourage what we would call more holistic engagement towards the Middle East. Because, one of the things that we believe about peace, in terms of peace being possible, is any solution is going to have to be one that addresses human rights concerns, humanitarian needs, for all people, not just for one people group over another.
Thank you. Well, maybe I thought we can finish with a question that I like. When we talk to each other often as we travel, we find out so much similar stories from our cultures. And I wonder if we can, in a minute or two each, share a story that we've taken from the other culture or borrowed from the other culture. Could be religious or cultural aspect.
I'll tell a story about Daniel. I said that I told him I might tell this story, but I have two, but one of them is when we've done these speaking tours around the US, Daniel would talk about growing up in the United States and how he desired deeply to return to this historic land that's connected to his people, so much so that he would walk around with soil from Israel in his shoes. And I just had this image of that. And so, sometimes when I see you, Daniel, I want to say, do you still have that dirt in your shoes?
It's on the bottom of my shoe now.
But just the reminder of how sacred the place is to you and to your people, I think is a beautiful and wonderful reminder. And then my second story was the first time I traveled to the region. I mentioned I didn't know the narrative of the Palestinians, and I was at Bethlehem Bible College and heard the story of the founder there, Bashara Awad, who told about being a Palestinian refugee from 1948 and what that experience was like for his family. And I remember just weeping at what I did not know. And so I think the reminder that the place is sacred and that there's history of these two incredible peoples is a really beautiful thing for us to carry with us.
Thank you, May. Daniel?
So I'll say, Aziz, you're talking about kind of shared stories within each of our different religious traditions. So I'll first mention that at Mosaica, we're putting out together with a project called People of the Book, a series of short animated videos that highlights sort of the common narratives, particularly between Judaism and Islam. So we just did the Temple Mount Al-Aqsa, as you can see where I am, that's in my background here. And we're doing a story about Avraham Ibrahim of the shared story, and then Yosef, the story of Joseph, and going through all the different kind of biblical heroes that are also within Islam and within Jewish traditions, highlighting kind of the similar things. And we have it both in Arabic, going to millions of viewers in the Arabic-speaking world, and also in Hebrew, going to Jewish Hebrew speakers and Jewish schools. But I'll share one story, which I often have told over MEJDI tours, which is that I think every Jewish tour group that goes to the Western Wall, again, which is in my background here, always hears a story from their tour guide that once upon a time there were two brothers who lived on opposite sides of a mountain, one with many children, one with few children, and they each had a deep concern for the well-being of the other. but somehow maybe over quarantine, I don't know, they weren't talking to each other, they weren't in touch with each other. And in the middle of the night, each brother would go ahead and give some of their own produce to the other. One had, the one who was a bachelor was concerned with the one who had a lot of children, that they had a lot of people to feed. And the one who had children said, I have so many helpers. The bachelor's all alone. Let me go and help that person. And each morning they would wake up and be amazed that they had the same amount of produce that they had the night before, even though they had given over some to their brother. And then finally, after several nights at the top of the mountain, they meet and bump into each other, each bringing the produce to the other. They hug and they embrace, and then a heavenly voice comes down and says, on this space will be, the temple will be built, because it's a place of brotherly love and justice and reconciliation. And I always knew that story. I think every Jewish child that comes to the Western Wall knows that story. What I didn't know was, I did some research on that, found out that this was actually an ancient Palestinian story that was converted to become a Jewish narrative only in the 19th century. And I think I love telling that over to MEJDI tours, because I think that, we could actually have a conflict over whose narrative of sharing and brotherly love does this belong to. So if we can share somewhat of the narrative and the meaning behind the space, then I think we can also find a way to share these sacred spaces that seem to be so contested.
You make it very good way to end this episode. This was an amazing, great discussion. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, May, for sharing with us and for joining us today. Our next session will be on Monday, 12 p.m. East time. We'll be speaking with Steve Rubin, who's also, again, one of our good friends, who will virtually lead us on a fascinating tour. So it'll be a little different than today, but he's going to take us to some of the off the beaten path kind of places. We'll visit all kind of areas in Israel and Palestine. Steve is pretty much a specialist in that. He always likes to find these places that nobody knows about, and I've co-led tours with him for MEJDI, so I'm excited to have him, and hopefully he will take us to places I haven't been to as well.
Thank you, guys. I'll just say thanks as well. It was fascinating today, and it's also a good time to say thank you to our behind-the-scenes people that are making all of this happen. So thank you, Shannon, Joseph, Aaron, and Susan for helping put this together. I will also remind everyone that we're having the photo contest to submit your pictures by Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern to info@mejditours.com.
And finally, I'd like to give a big thanks to everyone that attended today's session. Without you, we'd be just talking to ourselves, which we've done quite a bit of that in the last few weeks as well. But for those inclined to do so, we have a donate button on the live stream page. We have shared a link to that page in the chat as well. By donating to this effort, you'll help us maintain our commitment to supporting and strengthening our communities that we visit. Proceed will be shared with those in need, including our local guides and organizations that we work with. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you on Monday.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Shalom. Bye-bye.